Sometimes the loudest injustice is the one no one stops to question. A cool September drizzle settled gently over Maplewood Elementary School just as the morning bell echoed across the neighborhood. Yellow school buses pulled away one after another while parents hurried their children through the front entrance, backpacks bouncing, laughter filling the crisp air. Teachers stood beneath colorful banners welcoming students back for another week of learning. The sidewalks buzzed with cheerful conversations, tiny sneakers splashing through shallow puddles, and the familiar excitement that only the beginning of a school day could bring. Yet only a few feet away from all that happiness stood one child who never crossed the front gate. 8-year-old Emma Collins quietly held the straps of her faded blue backpack with both hands. Her blonde hair rested neatly beneath a light gray hood, tiny drops of rain gathering along its edges before slipping silently to the ground. She did not cry. She did not argue. She did not ask anyone to make an exception. She simply stood where the sidewalk met the school entrance, watching other children disappear into classrooms that she desperately wished she could enter. Every few minutes she glanced through the glass doors, smiling faintly whenever she recognized another student waving at a friend inside. Then she lowered her eyes again, waiting with a patience no child should ever have to learn. A school administrator had spoken kindly only moments earlier. "I am sorry, sweetheart. Until the paperwork is complete, we cannot let you inside." The words had been polite. Gentle, even. No raised voices. No anger. Only rules carefully followed. Emma had nodded respectfully. "I understand," she answered with remarkable calm. "I can wait." She stepped away from the entrance without another word and sat quietly on a weathered wooden bench beneath a maple tree overlooking the school courtyard. From inside her backpack she carefully removed a slightly worn library book she had borrowed before her family's recent move. She opened it across her knees and began reading while occasionally lifting her eyes toward the classroom windows. Through the glass she could see children taking their seats as teachers wrote today's lessons across bright white boards. She softly traced the printed words inside her own book with one finger, silently following along as though she were already sitting among them. Across the street, a black luxury sedan slowed to a stop beside the curb. Daniel Carter glanced out the window while reviewing notes for the education partnership meeting he had just attended with local school officials. At 42, the self-made millionaire had spent years donating to scholarships, technology programs, and new school facilities across the state. Newspapers often praised his generosity, yet most of his contributions were measured in buildings, budgets, and statistics rather than individual faces. As his driver prepared to continue toward downtown Chicago, Daniel's attention lingered on the little girl beneath the maple tree. Something about the contrast refused to let him look away. Hundreds of children had entered the building. Only one remained outside. She was not playing. She was not waiting for a parent. She was studying. Alone. In the rain. Daniel lowered the folder resting in his lap. "Hold on," he said quietly. The driver looked into the rearview mirror. "Sir?" Daniel kept watching the little girl as she carefully turned another page, completely absorbed in learning from a place where she was not allowed to belong. "Please pull over," he said. "I think there is a story here that everyone else just walked past." Daniel Carter stepped out of the sedan without saying another word. His driver watched in quiet surprise as the millionaire buttoned his charcoal overcoat against the cool morning drizzle and crossed the sidewalk toward the old wooden bench beneath the maple tree. The sounds of morning announcements drifted faintly through open classroom windows while children settled into their seats inside. Emma Collins remained completely focused on the pages resting in her lap. She moved her finger beneath each sentence with remarkable care, occasionally whispering unfamiliar words to herself before smiling softly whenever she pronounced them correctly. She looked less like a child waiting outside a school and more like a student determined not to waste a single minute. Daniel slowed his pace as he approached. He had expected disappointment, perhaps frustration or tears. Instead, he found quiet determination. Good morning, he said gently. Emma immediately closed her book halfway and looked up with polite blue eyes. Good morning, sir, she answered with a warm smile that carried neither fear nor resentment. Daniel noticed the title of the library book resting on her knees. It was a beginner chapter book that many second-grade teachers recommended during the first semester. Several pages were marked with neatly folded scraps of paper, each one carefully cut from what looked like old grocery receipts. That is a good book, Daniel said. Emma nodded proudly. I wanted to finish it before I have to return it. Daniel glanced toward the school entrance only a short distance away. Should you not be inside reading it with your class? Emma lowered her eyes briefly before answering with complete honesty. I will be, she replied quietly. Just not today. Daniel sat beside her on the weathered bench, leaving enough space so she would not feel uncomfortable. Rain tapped gently against the colorful leaves above them, sending tiny drops onto the sidewalk below. Would you mind telling me what happened? He asked. Emma thought carefully before speaking. My mom and I moved here last week. She filled out everything she could, but one paper is still coming from our old town. They said I have to wait until it gets here. She shrugged with surprising acceptance. They were very nice about it. Daniel frowned slightly. And they asked you to stay outside? Emma quickly shook her head. No, sir. They asked if someone could pick me up, but my mom had to be at work this morning because it is her first week at a new job. She said she would come as soon as she could. She smiled again, as though trying to make the situation easier for everyone else. So I thought I could read while I waited. Daniel looked at the school building once more. Through the classroom windows he could see children raising their hands, teachers smiling, colorful maps hanging on bright walls, and shelves filled with books. Then he looked back at the little girl quietly teaching herself beneath a tree in the rain. Something about the contrast settled heavily inside him. He had spent years funding libraries larger than this one, donating computers to districts across the state, and speaking at education conferences about equal opportunity. Yet none of those accomplishments answered the simple question now forming in his mind. How could a child eager to learn be sitting outside while an empty desk waited inside? Emma carefully reopened her book and smiled apologetically. It is all right, she whispered. School will still be here tomorrow. Daniel did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the classroom windows before slowly returning to the determined little reader beside him. At that quiet moment he realized the problem standing before him was not a lack of classrooms, teachers, or resources. It was a closed door that no one had stopped long enough to question. Daniel remained seated beside Emma long after the morning bell had faded into the background. Neither of them hurried to fill the silence. It was the comfortable kind, broken only by the gentle rustling of maple leaves overhead and the distant voices of children answering questions inside their classrooms. Emma turned another page with careful fingers, completely absorbed in the story before quietly closing the book after reaching the end of the chapter. She looked toward the school building again, smiling softly as if imagining exactly where the lesson inside had reached. Daniel noticed she was unconsciously following the rhythm of the classroom. When the teacher paused, Emma paused. When students laughed, she smiled without hearing the joke. She was learning from behind a wall she could not cross. Do you like school that much? Daniel asked with genuine curiosity. Emma looked at him as though the answer should have been obvious. It is my favorite place, she said. My old teacher used to tell us that every book lets you visit somewhere you have never been. She gently touched the cover of the library book resting on her lap. I want to visit everywhere. Daniel smiled. Quietly. What do you want to be someday? Emma thought for only a second. A teacher, she answered. Because teachers open doors for people every day. Those simple words settled deeply inside him. Before he could reply, the front entrance opened again and a school secretary hurried outside carrying a folded umbrella. She approached with a kind but slightly worried expression. Emma, she called gently. You really should stay under the entrance canopy until your mother arrives. It is getting colder. Emma immediately stood and thanked her politely. I will be all right, Mrs. Reynolds. The tree keeps most of the rain away. Mrs. Reynolds smiled with obvious affection before noticing Daniel standing nearby. Good morning, she said professionally. I hope there has not been any misunderstanding. Daniel returned the greeting with equal courtesy. Not at all, he replied. Emma has explained everything very clearly. Mrs. Reynolds sighed softly. She is a wonderful little girl. We wish we could let her join her class today, but the enrollment file from her previous district has not been transferred yet. Our district policy requires the documentation before attendance can officially begin. Her voice carried genuine regret rather than indifference. Daniel listened carefully. There was no cruelty in her explanation. Only procedure. Who makes that decision? He asked calmly. Ultimately the principal, Mrs. Reynolds answered. But we all have to follow district guidelines. She hesitated before adding, no one here wants Emma sitting outside. After thanking them both, she quietly returned inside, the heavy glass doors closing gently behind her. Daniel watched the entrance for several long moments. He had expected to find someone unwilling to help. Instead, he found people trying to do the right thing while feeling trapped by rules larger than themselves. Emma sat back down on the bench and reopened her book without complaining. Mrs. Reynolds always smiles at me, she said happily. She even gave me hot chocolate yesterday while I waited. Daniel nodded slowly. The problem was becoming clearer with every passing minute. There was no villain standing at the school gate. There was only a system that had forgotten to make room for compassion when unusual situations appeared. He looked across the playground where dozens of children laughed during an early recess activity, then back at the empty space beside him where one eager student remained separated by paperwork instead of ability. He reached into his coat pocket and removed the invitation badge from the education partnership meeting he had attended earlier that morning. It still listed the names of the principal and district administrators. Folding the badge carefully into his hand, Daniel stood up with quiet determination. Emma, he said gently, would you mind if I asked your principal one simple question? Emma looked up with innocent curiosity. Do you think it will help? Daniel glanced once more toward the school entrance before offering a reassuring smile. I do not know yet, he admitted. But I believe every closed door deserves someone willing to knock. Daniel walked through the front entrance with calm, unhurried steps. The warmth inside the school contrasted sharply with the cool drizzle outside, carrying the familiar sense of sharpened pencils, fresh paper, and cafeteria pancakes lingering from breakfast. Children's artwork filled the hallways with bright colors, reminding every visitor that this building existed for dreams still taking shape. Mrs. Reynolds greeted him again and quietly led him toward the principal's office. Along the way, Daniel noticed open classroom doors where teachers patiently guided discussions, students raised eager hands, and every empty chair seemed to represent an opportunity waiting to be filled. One empty seat, however, belonged to Emma. Principal Margaret Wilson welcomed Daniel with professional courtesy. She recognized him immediately from the education partnership breakfast held earlier that morning. Mr. Carter, she said warmly, extending her hand. This is certainly an unexpected visit. Daniel returned the greeting with a polite smile before taking the chair across from her desk. Thank you for making time for me, he replied. I wanted to ask about one of your students. Margaret nodded with genuine curiosity. Emma Collins? Daniel was slightly surprised. You already know who I mean. The principal smiled gently. Everyone here knows Emma. She introduced herself to every teacher on her first visit before we realized the enrollment file had not been completed. She paused before adding quietly, she even asked whether she could borrow a library book while she waited because she did not want to stop learning. Daniel looked toward the classroom windows beyond the office door. Then why is she still sitting outside? Margaret folded her hands together before answering. Because the transfer records from her previous district have not arrived yet. State attendance requirements and district enrollment procedures require specific documentation before a student can officially begin classes. Until those records arrive, our system cannot activate her enrollment. Her voice carried neither defensiveness nor frustration, only the quiet weight of responsibility. Daniel noticed several folders neatly arranged across her desk, each representing another child, another family, another story. "Do you agree with that decision?" he asked softly. Margaret hesitated longer this time. Finally she answered with complete honesty. "I agree with following the law. I do not always agree with how little flexibility the process leaves us." Silence settled over the office. Rain tapped gently against the windows while distant laughter drifted in from the playground. Daniel understood something important in that quiet moment. The people inside this school were not uncaring. Mrs. Reynolds had offered Emma hot chocolate. Teachers had welcomed her warmly. The principal knew her by name after only one visit. Compassion already existed here. It simply had nowhere to go once paperwork became more powerful than judgment. Daniel slowly stood and walked toward the office window overlooking the front bench beneath the maple tree. Emma was still there. She had moved closer to the trunk to stay dry and was once again reading quietly, occasionally glancing toward the classroom where children continued their lessons. Margaret joined him beside the window. "She has done that every morning this week," she said. Almost in a whisper. "She reads until her mother finishes work and picks her up. She has never complained once." Daniel watched the little girl carefully turning another page as though every sentence mattered. Then he turned back toward the principal with calm eyes. "May I ask you something?" Margaret nodded. Daniel spoke gently, without accusation, without raising his voice. "If Emma were your granddaughter instead of a name in a file, would you truly believe the best place for her this morning is that bench outside?" The office became completely silent. Margaret did not answer immediately because the question was no longer about policies, regulations, or missing documents. It was about a child whose desire to learn had quietly become stronger than every rule standing between her and an empty desk waiting just beyond the school doors. Principal Margaret Wilson remained by the window for several long moments without speaking. Her eyes stayed fixed on the little bench beneath the maple tree where Emma patiently continued reading as though she had already accepted that learning from outside was simply part of her routine. Finally Margaret exhaled slowly and returned to her desk. She opened Emma's enrollment file once more, carefully reviewing every page that had already been submitted. There were medical forms, proof of residency, emergency contacts, and recommendation letters from Emma's previous teacher. Only one official transfer document remained delayed because of an administrative processing backlog in another district. Daniel quietly observed without interrupting. He had not come to criticize anyone. He had come to understand. Margaret pressed a button on her office phone. "Mrs. Reynolds, would you please ask Assistant Superintendent Michael Hayes if he is available for a brief call?" A few minutes later, the voice of the district administrator filled the speakerphone. Margaret calmly explained the situation from beginning to end. She described Emma's completed paperwork, the missing transfer record, and the little girl waiting outside every morning with a library book instead of sitting in class. There was a brief silence before Mr. Hayes responded. Thoughtfully. "The policy exists to protect accurate enrollment records," he said. "But there is also a temporary attendance provision for exceptional circumstances when residency has already been verified and student safety is not in question." Margaret looked up with visible surprise. "I have never seen that provision used before," she admitted. "It is rarely needed," he answered. "Most situations are resolved before they reach this point. However, the option does exist. The principal may authorize temporary classroom attendance while final documentation is pending, provided the remaining records are received within the designated timeframe." Margaret slowly lowered the receiver into its cradle. She glanced toward Daniel with a quiet expression that mixed relief with reflection. "The answer has been sitting inside the policy all along," she whispered. "I simply never thought to look beyond the first page." Daniel smiled gently. "Sometimes rules are written to protect children," he replied. "We just forget to begin by looking at the child." Margaret immediately stood, gathered the necessary forms, and walked briskly toward the front entrance. Daniel followed several steps behind. Outside, Emma looked up from her book as the principal approached with an unusually bright smile. "Emma," Margaret said warmly, kneeling until they were eye level, "would you like to come inside and meet your teacher?" Emma blinked once, almost afraid she had misunderstood. "Today?" she asked softly. Margaret nodded. "Yes. Today." Emma carefully closed her book and held it against her chest without saying another word. For a brief moment she simply looked toward the school doors that had remained closed all week. Then she stood, adjusted the straps of her faded blue backpack, and quietly followed the principal toward the entrance. As she reached the doorway, she stopped and turned back toward Daniel. There were no dramatic speeches. No tears. Only a grateful smile filled with more joy than words could ever carry. "Thank you for knocking," she said. Daniel smiled in return. "You were the one who never stopped believing the door would open." Emma walked through the entrance with calm steps, disappearing into the bright hallway where colorful student artwork lined the walls and cheerful voices echoed from nearby classrooms. Her empty desk would no longer remain empty. Daniel remained standing beneath the maple tree as the heavy glass doors gently closed behind her. Around him, the morning looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. The rain still fell softly. Parents still hurried toward work. Cars still rolled past the school. Yet everything had quietly changed because one child had finally reached the place where she had belonged from the very beginning. Emma stepped into her classroom so quietly that only a few students noticed at first. Her teacher, Mrs. Harper, paused in the middle of a reading lesson and greeted her with the kind smile Emma had imagined every morning from outside the window. "Class," she said warmly, "we have been waiting for someone very special to join us." Every child turned toward the doorway. Instead of feeling nervous, Emma held her library book a little closer and smiled politely before walking toward the only empty desk in the room. It was the same desk she had looked at through the classroom window day after day. Now it was finally hers. Mrs. Harper gently placed a fresh notebook and a sharpened pencil on the desktop. "Welcome, Emma," she whispered. "We are very happy you are here." Emma ran her fingertips across the smooth notebook cover for just a second before opening it carefully to the first blank page. Outside the classroom, Daniel stood quietly beside Principal Margaret Wilson, watching through the narrow window in the door. Neither of them wanted to interrupt the lesson. They simply observed the little girl who had waited so patiently finally becoming part of the place she had never stopped believing she belonged. Mrs. Harper invited the class to continue reading aloud together. As dozens of young voices filled the room, Emma immediately joined them without hesitation. She had followed every lesson from the bench so faithfully that she never missed a single line. Margaret smiled in amazement. "She already knows exactly where they are," she whispered. Daniel nodded slowly. "She never stopped learning," he replied. "She simply learned from the wrong side of the door." Later that afternoon, Emma's mother, Sarah Collins, arrived at the school after finishing work. She hurried through the front office with visible concern, expecting to find her daughter waiting in the reception area as usual. Mrs. Reynolds welcomed her with an unusually bright smile. "You might want to look through that window first," she said gently. Sarah stepped quietly toward the classroom door. Inside, she saw Emma sitting among her classmates, eagerly raising her hand to answer a question. The little girl looked completely at home. Tears quietly filled Sarah's eyes, not from sadness, but from relief that had been waiting all week for permission to appear. When the school day ended, Emma ran into her mother's arms carrying her notebook, the library book, and a simple sheet of paper covered with neat handwriting. Look, she said excitedly. Mrs. Harper said my reading journal starts today instead of next week. Sarah hugged her daughter tightly before turning toward Daniel and Principal Wilson. I do not know how to thank you, she said sincerely. Daniel smiled gently and shook his head. Your daughter did the hardest part, he answered. She never gave up on learning. Margaret nodded in agreement. She reminded all of us why schools exist in the first place. That evening, after the classrooms had emptied and the hallways had grown quiet, Principal Wilson remained alone in her office reviewing district policies once again. This time she read every paragraph slowly, paying close attention to the temporary enrollment provision she had overlooked for years. She began making notes in the margins, highlighting procedures that could help future families avoid the same unnecessary delay. The next morning she scheduled a meeting with district administrators, determined to ensure every principal understood that compassion and policy were never meant to stand on opposite sides of the same doorway. Across town, Daniel returned to his office carrying no awards, no contracts, and no headlines from the day. Yet as he looked out across the city skyline, one image remained clearer than every business success he had ever achieved. A little girl reading patiently beneath a maple tree while an empty desk waited only a few yards away. He quietly realized that changing a life did not always begin with writing a generous check. Sometimes it began with asking one thoughtful question that gave kindness permission to walk through an open door. The weeks that followed settled into a gentle rhythm that felt almost ordinary, yet everyone who had witnessed that rainy morning understood something meaningful had quietly changed. Emma arrived at school every day before the first bell, always carrying the same faded blue backpack and the same library book until she proudly returned it after finishing the final chapter. She no longer waited beneath the maple tree. Instead, she walked through the front doors with a cheerful smile, greeting Mrs. Reynolds each morning as though they had been friends for years. Before heading to her classroom, she paused beside the bench outside for just a moment, running her hand lightly across the weathered wood before continuing inside. It became her quiet reminder that hope should never be forgotten simply because life had become easier. Daniel occasionally found himself driving past Maplewood Elementary before work, never announcing his visits and never stepping inside unless invited. One crisp October morning he noticed children gathering on the playground while Emma sat beneath the same maple tree during recess. This time she was not alone. 3 younger students surrounded her, listening with complete attention as she read aloud from another library book. Every few pages she stopped to explain unfamiliar words, smiling patiently until everyone understood. Daniel remained inside his parked car, watching from across the street with quiet admiration. Mrs. Harper happened to notice him and walked over after recess ended. She does that almost every day now, the teacher said warmly. Some of our first graders were nervous about reading, so Emma started helping them during recess without anyone asking. Daniel smiled. She is already becoming the teacher she told me she wanted to be. Mrs. Harper nodded. Children often become exactly what someone believed they could become. Later that month, the school hosted family reading night. Parents, grandparents, teachers, and students gathered throughout the library carrying blankets, favorite books, and homemade cookies to celebrate the joy of reading together. Principal Margaret Wilson invited Daniel to attend as a guest, not because he had donated money or sponsored the event, but because she wanted him to see the difference one thoughtful conversation had made. The library buzzed with laughter as children proudly shared stories with their families. Emma spotted Daniel standing quietly near the entrance and hurried over carrying a folded sheet of construction paper decorated with carefully drawn crayons, colored pencils, and tiny maple leaves. I made something for you, she said shyly. Daniel accepted it with both hands before unfolding the paper. Inside was a simple drawing of a school gate standing wide open. Beyond the gate stretched rows of books, smiling children, and a bright classroom filled with sunlight. At the bottom, written in careful second-grade handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for asking the question that opened my first day." Daniel looked at the drawing for several long seconds before meeting Emma's hopeful eyes. This is beautiful, he said quietly. May I keep it? Emma smiled. That is why I made it. Principal Wilson, standing nearby, glanced at the drawing before looking toward the entrance of the library where families continued arriving together. You know, she said thoughtfully, I have replayed your question in my mind many times since that morning. Daniel looked at her with quiet curiosity. Margaret smiled gently. It was never really about Emma alone. It was about remembering that every policy begins with a person. Daniel carefully folded the drawing and placed it inside the leather portfolio he carried to every business meeting. Contracts, financial reports, and investment plans filled most of its compartments. Yet somehow this simple piece of construction paper felt more valuable than every document surrounding it. As the evening came to an end, Emma returned to the reading circle where younger children eagerly waited for her next story. Daniel watched her open another book while tiny faces gathered closer to listen. At that peaceful moment he understood something he had never learned in any boardroom. Real leadership was not measured by how many doors a successful person could walk through. It was measured by how many doors remained open after they quietly chose to stop and care. As autumn slowly gave way to winter, the story of one little girl quietly changed more than a single classroom. Principal Margaret Wilson kept the promise she had made to herself on the evening Emma finally entered school. During district leadership meetings, she shared the overlooked temporary enrollment procedure with principals from neighboring schools, encouraging them to review every policy through the eyes of the children those policies were meant to serve. The discussion was not about ignoring rules. It was about remembering why the rules existed in the first place. Several schools soon updated their enrollment guidelines to make certain that families facing temporary administrative delays would receive immediate support instead of unnecessary waiting whenever state regulations allowed reasonable flexibility. No newspaper reported the change. No television cameras arrived. Yet dozens of children quietly entered classrooms on their first day because someone had remembered a little girl reading beneath a maple tree. Daniel never sought recognition for any of it. When community leaders praised his contributions to education during annual fundraising dinners, he politely redirected the conversation toward teachers, principals, and school staff who chose compassion every day without applause. Buildings matter, he often said. But people change lives. Those simple words gradually became part of every education partnership his foundation supported. Rather than focusing only on scholarships and technology grants, Daniel introduced a new initiative called Open Gate. The program provided volunteer teams who helped families complete enrollment paperwork, understand district requirements, and connect with school offices before the first day of class. The goal was never to replace existing systems. It was simply to make sure no child felt alone while trying to enter them. Sarah Collins became one of the program's first volunteers. Having experienced the confusion of transferring between school districts herself, she patiently guided new families through every form, every deadline, and every question that once seemed overwhelming. She often smiled while telling nervous parents, "You are not bothering anyone by asking for help." Schools are meant to welcome children, and sometimes welcoming families begins with explaining the paperwork. Emma occasionally accompanied her mother after school, sitting quietly at community information tables with a stack of children's books ready for younger brothers and sisters waiting while adults completed enrollment forms. She always greeted every child exactly the same way. "Would you like to read with me while they finish?" Soon laughter replaced nervous silence around those tables. Books opened. Friendships began. Waiting no longer felt lonely. One snowy afternoon Daniel stopped by a community enrollment event without announcing his visit. He found Emma sitting beside a little boy who looked frightened about starting a new school after moving across the state. She opened one of her favorite storybooks and pointed to the first page with an encouraging smile. "The hardest part is walking through the door," she told him gently. "After that, you start finding friends." Daniel remained across the room, quietly watching the conversation unfold. He recognized the same calm confidence he had first seen beneath the maple tree months earlier. The difference was that Emma was now giving someone else exactly what she had once needed herself. Before leaving, Daniel walked over and thanked her for helping. Emma looked surprised. "I am only reading," she said. Daniel smiled warmly. Sometimes reading is another way of opening a door. Emma thought about those words before looking toward the little boy who was now smiling at the pictures inside the book. She nodded softly as though she had just discovered another meaning hidden inside her favorite stories. Outside, fresh snow covered the sidewalks leading toward Maplewood Elementary. Children laughed while leaving school, their footprints crossing paths in every direction. Looking at those tiny tracks stretching toward the future, Daniel quietly realized that kindness rarely traveled in straight lines. It moved from one heart to another, one classroom to another, one family to another, until the smallest act of compassion became a pathway countless others could follow without ever knowing where it had first begun. Years passed more quickly than anyone expected. Seasons continued painting the maple tree outside Maplewood Elementary in shades of green, gold, and white, while generations of students hurried through the same front entrance carrying backpacks filled with books and dreams. The old wooden bench beneath the tree remained exactly where it had always been, carefully restored but never replaced. Principal Margaret Wilson insisted it stay there because, as she often told new teachers, every school should remember the lesson that changed it. A small bronze plaque had been placed quietly beside the bench. It did not mention a millionaire, a donation, or a special event. It simply read, "Every child deserves an open door." Most students walked past without thinking twice about the words. Yet every adult who knew the story paused for just a moment before continuing inside. Daniel Carter still visited the school from time to time, always arriving without an announcement and always leaving before anyone could organize a ceremony in his honor. Success had continued to follow him in business, but the accomplishment that remained closest to his heart could never be measured on a financial statement. One bright spring morning he accepted an invitation to attend Career Day at Maplewood Elementary. Children filled the auditorium with excited conversations as guests described their professions and encouraged young minds to dream boldly about the future. Daniel sat quietly in the front row, listening with genuine interest as teachers introduced the final speaker. A young woman walked confidently onto the stage carrying a stack of well-loved children's books. Her blonde hair caught the morning sunlight streaming through the auditorium windows, and her warm blue eyes immediately settled on the students waiting eagerly before her. Daniel smiled before anyone even announced her name. Emma Collins had become exactly who she had once dreamed of becoming. She began her presentation not by speaking about herself but by opening one of her favorite storybooks. Dozens of children leaned forward, completely captivated before the first page had even been turned. When the story ended, one little boy raised his hand and asked, "Miss Collins, why did you become a teacher?" Emma looked around the room for a moment before answering with the same gentle confidence she had carried since childhood. "Because someone once reminded me that opening one classroom door can change an entire life." Her eyes briefly found Daniel sitting quietly among the audience. No one else noticed the silent exchange between them, but neither of them needed words to understand the memory they shared. After the event concluded, children hurried toward recess while Emma walked outside with Daniel beneath the familiar maple tree. They stopped beside the old bench where everything had begun. Emma smiled as she rested one hand lightly against the weathered wood. "I still remember every page I read here," she said softly. Daniel looked toward the school entrance where children freely came and went, laughing together without hesitation. "And now they remember you," he replied. Emma reached into her bag and removed a brand new library card. It belonged to one of her newest students who had proudly earned the privilege of borrowing books for the first time. "I keep an extra one with me," she explained with a smile. "Whenever a child forgets theirs, I remind them that every story is waiting patiently. Sometimes all someone needs is help opening the first page." Daniel laughed quietly before looking once more at the busy school around them. The bench was no longer a place where a child waited outside. It had become a quiet symbol of compassion remembered, lessons learned, and opportunities shared. As he prepared to leave, he glanced back one final time and watched Emma welcome another nervous student through the front doors with the same reassuring smile that had once carried her through uncertainty. The school looked no different than it had years before, yet its heart had changed forever. Because education does not truly begin when a lesson starts or when a bell rings. It begins the moment one person chooses to see a child not as paperwork, not as a problem, but as a future waiting for someone kind enough to open the door.